This is the West Wall, the Atlantic Wall. It had taken German engineers 4 years to design, and hundreds of thousands of enslaved workers from all over Europe 4 years to build. Hitler and Rommel, who was so soon to die, had boasted that no Allied army would be able to maintain itself on European soil for more than 9 hours. But even as the Nazis boasted, so the Allied leaders made their plans. And they chose the coast of Normandy for their landing ground. In the early hours of June the 6th, 1944, planes of British and American airborne divisions took off for France, while in the channel below sailed the ships carrying the men of the 21st Army Group who had been chosen for the assault. Already, Allied heavy bombers were battering down the German defenses. And the guns of the Navy were tearing gaps into the steel and concrete walls of Fortress Europe. For the Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, and for Admiral Ramsay in command of the Allied fleet, these were anxious hours. The great machine had been set in motion. It must not stop. To build it, free men and women all over the world had sweated and strained, and they had put their trust in it. And also on it rested the hopes of the peoples of occupied Europe. But these men from New York, Chicago, or Tennessee were confident. So were their comrades from London, and Glasgow, or Kent. And among the British were many who had bitter memories of 1940, of Dunkirk, of a dead brother, or of a friend. Courcelles, Saint-Aubin, Langrune, Ouistreham, Port-en-Bessin, Saint-Vaast, Arromanches. Remember these names. For there the fate of civilization was being settled between man and man, machine and machine, in the shallow ditches and the muddy sea. While Allied supplies were being rushed to Normandy, another battle was going on behind the German lines. Planes of the Allied air forces were destroying the railways, the roads, and the bridges over which the German reinforcements would have to pass. Germans were waiting for reinforcements, which were said to be on their way. They waited in vain. Allied reinforcements kept coming all the time. June the 6th, June the 7th, June the 8th, June the 9th. Every day, fresh troops poured through the twisted ruins of the West Wall. The Battle of the Beaches has been won, said General Montgomery on June the 11th. Already the British had taken Bayeux. The Americans, to the west, were pushing on toward Carentan. The first phase was over. From now on, the Allies would continue to advance. All along the outer rim of the Allied bridgehead, bitter fighting went on. Flail tanks were beating paths through the hidden minefields. And behind the shelling came soldiers in twos and threes, in platoons and companies, plodding forward in battalions, making prisoners here, going forward again. Taking more prisoners. Street fighting, taking a village, rounding up more prisoners. Going forward in brigades, becoming divisions, and part of something immeasurable, the offensive. As the Germans retreated, they left behind them chaos and ruin. To speed the advance, Allied soldiers, with the help of French civilians, began to repair the broken railway lines. Sappers began to clear the streets of wrecked villages and towns. The Allies tried to restore life as quickly as possible to all those communities which had suffered in the battle. At the same time, they set about remaking the shell-pitted roads to speed supplies to the front. And they laid down airstrips in the open fields to provide Allied soldiers with fighter cover and protection. June the 12th, June the 13th, British and Canadian troops began to push a wedge-shaped salient eastward toward the city of Caen. German resistance was growing stiffer. It was in this area that the German commander hoped to wear down the British armor. This calculation gave the Americans their chance. From the Carentan estuary, they struck a double blow, one across the neck of the peninsula and the other toward the great port of Cherbourg. June the 16th, June the 17th, the plan that General Bradley had drawn up on his maps was being fought out in the fields and villages. June the 18th, the Americans in Banville, the peninsula cut in two. the second thrust was also going well. By June the 24th, General Bradley and his men were on the outskirts of the city of Cherbourg. By June the 25th, they were fighting in the streets. Behind every corner was a German tank. And in every house there were German snipers. The enemy commander had given his word that the city would be defended to the last man and the last bullet. But like Field Marshal Paulus at Stalingrad, von Schlieben preferred to keep his skin rather than his word. He surrendered, and where he led them, his troops followed. On June the 26th, Cherbourg was set free. Cherbourg, second only to Marseilles as a port. Mr. Churchill visited the city soon after its liberation. He inspected the launching sites the Germans had erected there for their secret weapons against England. One of the last acts of the German garrison had been to destroy the harbor installations of Cherbourg, so as to deny them to the Allies. The Germans knew that the Allies must have the use of a first-class port to bring ashore all the tanks, the lorries and guns, ammunition and stores a modern army needs. The Allies, therefore, began to repair the wrecked wharves with great determination. For this important task, French workers volunteered at once. The Germans knew that if they could prevent the Allies from seizing and putting into working order any great port, they could defeat the invasion. But the Allies had foreseen this. They had constructed floating harbors in England, and they towed them across the channel in sections. The huge concrete piers were sunk into position to form a breakwater, and more than 60 ships were sunk in line to make an outer wall. Great floating piers and walls that rose and fell with the tide were set up. Soon, lorries and tanks were rolling down toward the beaches in ever greater numbers. Out at the front, every vehicle was needed desperately, urgently, immediately. Behind the lines in Cherbourg, life was slowly going back to normal. There was food again in the marketplace, and gossip and argument about the latest news. There were newspapers again, written and printed by Frenchmen who again were free. And moreover, for the first time in 4 years, French men and women were free to celebrate the 14th of July. Old soldiers of the last war saw American soldiers and French sailors marching shoulder to shoulder in this, a symbol of the friendship between the United Nations that must continue when peace comes. While the men of General Bradley's armies were clearing the tip of the Cherbourg Peninsula, British and Canadian troops of the Second Army began a great offensive on the eastern flank of the bridgehead.